and considerations for successful implementation and integration. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. A reminder that all participants are currently on mute, and this means that by listening, you will not have any concerns that your external background will interrupt our programming. There is a Q&A feature for questions or comments, and we want this to be interactive. Use this to communicate with our panelists. We will address questions at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded, and at the conclusion of our presentation, we'll be sharing the recording, the slides, as well as some key takeaways. I'm now going to turn this over to Philip Smith, Head of Regulatory Affairs and Operations for Product Life Group, to introduce himself and our panel.
Hey, great. Thank you, Gail. What I'd suggest is we'll just leave it one more minute, just to allow as many people as possible to join the call, and then we'll kick off. So we'll make a start in a minute. Okay. This is where we need some background music to kind of entertain everybody while we wait.
I think you're probably good to go now, Philip.
Okay, let's make a start. Thanks, Gail. And thank you and welcome to everybody on the call today. I'm going to be exploring the topic of marketing authorization transfers. So if you head to the next slide, please, Nick. Thank you. So, okay, so my name is Phil Smith, and as Gail said, I head up the Regulatory Affairs and Operations Business Unit at PLG. So PLG is a service provider. We help customers of all shapes and sizes with a range of different services, including regulatory, pharmacovigilance, quality assurance, and digital and consulting. And at PLG, I have a team of approximately 500 people, regulatory professionals working with me, and we deliver services to clients across the product life cycle. I've been in regulatory now for a long time, doing a variety of different roles, in operational roles, in leadership roles. I've got a lot of experience supporting companies with large-scale outsourcing programs, and also experience in terms of the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is how to support companies and how companies should consider and set themselves up for success in terms of license acquisition programs. So moving portfolios of products from one company to another, or even companies where they're purchasing other companies. So I'm joined today by two other colleagues from Product Life Group, and that's fortunate for me because, as you may hear, I have got a little bit of a sore throat today, so talking for an hour might be a little bit challenging. So luckily I've got James and Nick with me today. So James, very experienced member of my team, has a lot of deep regulatory experience with a particular focus in Europe and in the UK. So again, James has been in a variety of different roles during his career, both in pharma and now at Product Life Group. At Product Life Group, he manages all of the resources. He's responsible for staffing our regulatory projects and programs, making sure we have the right people with the right expertise in the right locations to support all of the customers that we're supporting. And we're also joined by Nick. So Nick Larson is a member of our Consulting and Digital Business Unit. So Nick is going to talk today about the really important topic, connected topic of data migration. So the license transfers themselves, the marketing authorization transfers that we're going to talk about from an operational perspective, need to be accompanied by transfer of a large amount of data, so regulatory dossiers and regulatory information. And that's where Nick is specialized. So he heads up the team that manages data migration projects, all sorts of different types of data, not just regulatory data, but data migration for our customers. And he will talk through how that can be managed, and also some innovative technology that can be used to support in the data migration piece of work. So that's who's going to be talking to you today. So if we move through, I'll give an overview, Nick, if you click through a couple of slides, thank you, in terms of what today's session is going to look like. Okay, so I'll introduce the topic and hopefully, shine a light onto why we think it's an important one to talk about today. That will move into what really is, the critical phase, the phase you really need to get right, which is the planning phase, right? These can be highly complex programs involving hundreds, if not thousands, of products and licenses in many countries, right? So how you're setting up from a planning perspective is really critical, right? You've got to get that piece right. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking through the considerations from a planning perspective. I'll then hand over to James, who will talk about the next phase. Okay, you've done the planning. How do you operationalize and put that plan into effect and make sure that the submissions are made on time, that there's the right quality, they're going to get approved, and the licenses will be transferred. The acquiring company becomes the new marketing authorization holder. As I said, Nick will cover the data migration piece, really important topic, of course, as I've just mentioned. And then hopefully we've left some time at the end to wrap up. And if you do have any questions, as Gail pointed out, you can enter those into the chat facility, and we'll answer those today. What I would also say is that if you don't get a chance to ask a question today, if something pops up into your mind afterwards, please do get in touch. We will share the recording of today's session for those of you who are interested or want to pass it on to colleagues. We'll also share the slides and we'll include some contact detail in those slides, including the details for our colleague Helen, who's on the call today, who will support us from that kind of follow-up perspective if you've got any questions that you want to get to the team today. Okay, so if we move on then, Nick, to the next slide. So the introduction, if you click through one more, thank you. Okay, so today, topic, marketing authorization transfers, planning and operational considerations for successful implementation. So we are going to give you those key considerations, right? Some things to think about, right? If you're engaged in one of these type of projects or programs, if your company's thinking about selling products or acquiring products, what are the things you need to be thinking about and considering? What are the tips and strategy you need to ensure? Because we're talking about authorized products here, so they're on the market. How do you ensure business continuity through the transfer of those products? And what we've learned through helping some of our customers through this type of activity. This is the first in 2 webinars that we have planned. So watch out for the next one that's coming along in November. As I said, today we're focusing on one end of the product life cycle, which are approved products, marketed products. We're going to follow that up with a session at the other end of the scale, which is products in development. So looking at in-licensing deals, which of course are also a really hot topic. Again, tips and strategies if you're thinking about engaging in licensing or out licensing in terms of making those sort of projects a success. So that's today's webinar. If we move on. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so why is this an interesting topic? Why should we be talking about this to you today? It's interesting because there's a lot of it going on, right? So this slide summarizes just the major deals from a mergers and acquisition perspective that have occurred in the last 3 years. And this we could have included more, right? There's recent deals that have just been announced, which we could have added on as well. But I think what you can see, without going through every name and detail on the slide, is there's some eye-wateringly large dollar value deals taking place here, right? Between some of the big names in pharma. This is focused on mergers and acquisitions, so where companies are actually going out and buying another company wholesale, right? What we could have also included in here would be portfolio acquisitions. There's been some recent, in the last 5-10 years, mega deals where whole portfolios of consumer health products, for example, have been sold off from one company to another. And really that's to help companies realize their commercial objectives, their strategic objectives. Where do they want to focus their therapeutic area, their geographical coverage, and acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions can support that strategy. Of course, you can develop assets yourselves, and of course, the companies listed here are doing that as well, but that can be supplemented through acquisition of existing products. Okay, so that's just to give an insight in terms of the scope, the volume, the level of activity that's occurring in this space. In the next slide, and it's a bit of a tee up for the subsequent webinar, which is more focused on in-licensing and products that are at the development stage. You can see there's a huge amount of activity, and again, we're kind of focusing on, and this is from a dollar value, again, some of the key deals for products that are not yet registered. And you can, if you orientate yourself to the slide, the right-hand column there splits out, the upfront payments that are made as part of those deals, and then you have a subsequent larger payment that is triggered upon hitting particular regulatory milestones, for example. So again, some really big numbers are at play here from a dollar value, and you can see that it includes products at all stages of development, from really early preclinical through to phase 3, and almost at registration. So again, we'll be covering this in more detail in terms of the strategies and tips from an in-licensing perspective in the follow-on webinar. So that's why we think it's important to talk to you about it. So we will now move on to the next slide, which is, what are you looking to achieve, right? What's the overarching goal of a license transfer project, and how are you setting up to achieve that goal? So essentially, we've split it out into the different phases, and that's what we're going to talk through in the webinar today. So the due diligence, what is it that you're buying? Understand what you're buying. Hopefully you know why you're buying it, right? Because again, it's fitting in with your commercial strategy. So a little bit on due diligence, moving into project planning and the operational implementation, followed by the data migration piece. But all of that together, those different phases have, from a marketed product perspective, a key goal, right? Which is to keep product supplied into all the markets where it's registered, right? We want to make sure that patients who are dependent on medicines are able to receive those prescribed medicines. We want to make sure that consumers they want to buy over-the-counter medicines, for example, have availability. Those medicines remain in stock and supplied to the market. So that's the ultimate goal, right? As we see it in terms of a successful marketing authorization transfer program. So to keep that goal in mind. Okay, so that's what you want to achieve. Now we're going to talk about how you go about doing that. So if you move to the next slide, please, Nick. And one more, thank you. Okay, so I said I'd spend just a little bit of time on the due diligence topic. So this really could be a standalone presentation on its own. There are lots of different aspects to due diligence in terms of the process, the technical expertise that's required to support the due diligence activities. So, but just at a high level, right? You can think of it in terms of a phased approach. That starts with, what is it you're looking for, right? We called it window shopping here during the feasibility phase. So at this point, right, really, there's very high level visibility in terms of the data that's available to start looking at, publicly available data, essentially. Are these products that you're interested in? Why are you interested in them? Do they fill a gap in your current portfolio that you would like to fill? Okay, so you've identified the potential targets, and then you have to do the due diligence step, which is really understanding, again, what is it that you're buying, right? Are you confident in the data? Are you confident in the products and the data that sits behind them? Are there any red flags that are raised or possibly raised as you look through that data? Are there any challenges from a regulatory perspective, from a supply perspective, manufacturing perspective? post-approval commitments that you need to be aware of. So that is when the data becomes available, typically in a secure data room where your experts, your subject matter experts from different technical backgrounds will be able to look at the data that's made available to you, and then a decision can be made. Okay, we're happy, we'll proceed, we'll go through the negotiation and the contracting stage and close the deal. And at that point, it's then transitioning into, okay, how do we do this, right? How do we now move these products that we're in the process of acquiring into our portfolio? How do we integrate those products into the daily working of our regulatory teams? How do we manage that additional burden, right? Because there is a lot of effort that's involved during that phase. That's a little bit about due diligence. If we move to the next slide, Nick, so this just gives you a broad overview of some of the objectives and considerations from a regulatory planning perspective. Now, what I want you to take home from this slide is two things, really. Right? Again, I'm going to phrase it again. The overarching objective is to make sure the products that are involved here, these are marketed products, they remain available and on the market. Okay, and connected to that, you've signed a contract. The two companies have signed a contract. There are contractual obligations that need to be met during this process. Okay, so there will be obligations defined in the contracts, in the transitional service agreements, what the selling company is committing to in terms of things like supply of the product for a certain period of time, cut-off dates that are defined within those contractual documents that need to be met. Okay, but consider that this isn't something regulatory. We're talking about regulatory today, right, specifically, but consider the regulatory plan and the operationalization of that regulatory plan cannot be done in isolation, right? Because there are multiple other functions and stakeholders whose considerations, whose information, whose decisions and agreements need to be solicited, discussed, agreed upon, which feed into the regulatory plan, right? So we've listed a few of those different functions here. Supply chain, of course, I've mentioned now 2 or 3 times, let's keep the product in the market. We've talked about the legal and contractual obligations that you need to meet through this process. There could be HR considerations, right? If it's a company acquiring another company, the people will be going with that transaction. So how will we set up from an HR perspective to manage that? There'll be demands on capacity within the labeling and artwork teams that need to be planned for, ready to create the packaging in the new livery, your company for these products. There are manufacturing, CMC and manufacturing considerations that need to be factored into all of this feeding into the regulatory plan. You're going to have stock in market at certain times. There will be a bleed out where you're allowed to have stock in market in the current livery. What are the considerations? What are the agreements that are in place from the current manufacturers? For example, they could be third-party manufacturers that need to be considered. So lots of manufacturing that needs to be taken into account, quality agreements that need to be updated, your pharmacovigilance systems and obligations change, right? So they need to be addressed as well. And of course, the IT and systems integration piece that Nick will cover. So a lot of different touch points that feed into that regulatory plan. On the next slide, just diving into a little bit more detail on the actual considerations for the regulatory planning piece. So we basically divided this into 2, and James will elaborate and build on a lot of what's on this slide. So there are strategic considerations, there are operational considerations. So from a strategic perspective, what do you need to have in place to be a marketing authorization holder in the territories where the products are currently registered? Are you set up to be able to meet those obligations, right? Do you have, local representation where that's required, for example, the other key roles in place? Are you reliant on third parties to provide some of those services? Do you need to get that in place before the products are actually even transferred? Familiarity with those, regional, country-specific requirements is really, really important. I've spent some time already discussing the contractual agreements that are important, in terms of product supply, for example, the timelines when that would be agreed, it needs to be documented, the commitments around supply chain, for example, again, I already mentioned there may be outstanding obligations, post-approval commitments that need to be factored into as well. So a lot of different strategic considerations before you even think about, right, operationally, what do I need to have in place? The guidance, the regulatory requirements on how you transfer licenses is not harmonized, right? It differs from country to country, right? That's really important. So you need to understand, you need to have regulatory intelligence in place that lets you know upfront what sort of documentation is required, signatories. You're going to have documents, declarations signed by the current MAH. Who's that person going to be? Who's going to be able to sign on behalf of the new MAH, for example? Who's going to create those core submission packages? Is that going to be the current MAH? Are they going to do so much and hand it over to you? Are you going to do it all, for example? As I said, the guidance and the regulations are not harmonized. The things like, the review and approval time differ from market to market. Things like how long you're allowed to have stock in the current delivery in market differs from market to market, as does then the obligation to have stock in the new livery in market. All of this needs to be factored in from a timing perspective into the regulatory plan, as do, pending, regulatory or ongoing regulatory activities. If you've got ongoing variations or renewals, for example, they can impact the ability to submit a marketing authorization transfer application. There may be then linked submissions that you need to make, name change submissions, PSMF updates, for example, to link to the regulatory piece. There could be a backlog of outstanding variations that need to be considered. Who's going to do all of that work, right? And I think this is really important that you understand as you're going through the planning phase. This creates huge burden. This comes on top of the day-to-day work of your regulatory team. Do you have the capacity and the expertise to manage this? Are you going to need additional support and help potentially to get you through what can be, a peak of activities that can last a couple of years, right? I think with that, it's probably a good time to hand it over to James to start talking through in a bit more detail some of those operational considerations.
Thanks, Bill. So yeah, just sort of coming in on what Phil was saying and really building on some of the topics that he suggested in his opening statements there. This is really about setting you up for success, doing a bit of a deep dive on some of the due diligence considerations and strategic planning, really. And as Phil said, it's really multifaceted. Regulatory sitting in the middle, linking in with lots of different functions, and all those separate functions having their own considerations as well. But really, it's about the people, the effort, and the potential impact that this has, because these are significantly large projects. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll probably spend quite a bit of time on this slide, because what I've tried to encapsulate here is really some sort of key regulatory activities for the marketing authorization transfer. I've sort of put them into 6, 7 buckets, starting on the left-hand side, and there is a bit of crossover here in the due diligence and the strategic planning. But I think it's really important to sort of revisit some of those topics and to really emphasize that there is a significant amount of time and effort that needs to go into the planning. The actual regulatory activities in terms of the operational delivery are somewhat quite small in comparison to the planning, the oversight, the data gathering, etc. So when we talk about due diligence and strategic planning, you really want those clear contractual agreements to be defined and to have a clear scope of responsibility for each party. We've all been involved in marketing authorization transfers where you get to a certain point and you think, who's actually signing this, or who do I need to reach out to? Having that clarified at the front end is really, really important. The contract should really actually define who does what, who is responsible for escalation, What if things happen that we haven't accounted for in terms of the agreement and the transfer agreement and the finalization? So there could be, for example, unplanned changes in your manufacturing process. There could be anticipated disruptions to supply chain for quality issues, for example. All of those need to be considered, and all of those we need to be aware of how to respond when those happen within the process. We need to gain an understanding of the goals and expectations of all stakeholders. Phil talked about this also in his slides. He said, some companies just wholesale want to purchase the whole company. Other times you may want to just carve out a specific therapeutic area or a specific product portfolio to give you an immediate presence in a particular market or a particular region. So really understanding what is the objective of the seller and the purchaser is really, really important. Again, do they want to sell or buy everything? Are they open to dissect the portfolio to a certain extent? Will everything be sold and bought at the same time, or will it be phased? Because then if it's phased, you need to plan for that phasing. If it's all at once, there's also planning and considerations, but maybe in a more condensed period. And then understanding really what's critical to all parties. Is it the timeline? Is it the price? Is it the territories? Is it the portfolio expansion? Is it to promote supply chain continuity by having new manufacturers involved in your supply chain? All of this needs to be on the table and all of it needs to be discussed. For example, some clients just want to acquire a European marketing authorization just to trigger a GMP inspection. They actually have no real intention of actually launching the product in that territory. So again, that may change our approach and how we're thinking when we build to these. What is really important though is the gathering of data, the regulatory intelligence data, the product data that is really, really important to us as regulators to have so that we can start building and putting together the applications. Basic things like the product name, the marketing authorization numbers, what type of procedure is it? Is it a national procedure? Is it a centralized procedure? Is it an MRP? Is it a DCP? What markets are the products registered in? What's the current MA holding details in those markets? Who are the manufacturers? Are there shared packs, for example, that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about the labeling? What's the current registration status? Is it approved? Is it pending? Are there any authorization expiry dates that we need to be aware of? What's the life cycle status of those products? Are there pending renewals? Are there pending variations? Are there any ongoing? Are there any planned? All of this is fact finding for us. All of it's setting the scene for what we need to know to be able to transfer effectively. And underpinning all of that, are there any outstanding obligations of the current marketing authorization holder? Critical that we identify these early, any safety, quality, or regulatory obligations to ensure that we as regulators have all the relevant data and commitments from the seller to fulfill them as per the agreed timeframe of the current marketing authorization holder. So we want to be looking for, those risk management plans, those post-approval commitments, any CAPA commitments linked maybe with the product supply chain, planned process changes and associated regulatory obligations. So as you can see, there's a huge amount of information just at the product level that we need to gather. Also, there's that regulatory intelligence piece as well. What are the actual submission requirements? And again, we talked about the distribution of the products, the markets that we're targeting, etc., etc. Phil talked about this non-harmonized process, which it is, and we need to appreciate that because each and every market that we're going to go into is probably going to have different considerations, different approval timelines, different fees, and potentially different supplementary documents like your declarations from manufacturers and the marketing authorization holders. So again, that data gathering exercise is really, really imperative. Actually, when we move across to the actual preparation of the transfer package, once we've gone through all the strategy piece, it starts to fall into place and then it becomes fairly administrative. Your submission preparation, who are my signatories? I need my signatory from my present marketing authorization holding. And I also need it from the proposed marketing authorization holder. Do I have those actual accesses to the agency portals that I need? Maybe I do if I'm already in those markets. Maybe I don't if they're new markets that I'm looking to explore. So how can I get those accesses? Who can set them up for me? And where are they required and when do I need them by? Again, important considerations. The administrative side, I don't think I can understate it. Yes, they're fairly routine processes, but you still need documentation, your cover letters, your application forms, if applicable, proof of transfer agreements, proof of establishments, the availability of the QPPV and PSMF of a new marketing authorization holder. Phil alluded to some of that in his opening remarks. Your proof of payments, effective dates, etc. You may also need power of attorneys, letters of authorization if you're acting on behalf of the marketing authorization holder. And again, we need those updated labeling and packaging components. You may be changing your product names, you may be changing your marketing authorization numbers, you've got local representatives where it's applicable, any safety features and logos that you'll need to include as well. So all of this needs to be captured and accounted for. And then finally, and what I always think is quite a simple statement, but actually it's quite significant in itself, is the declaration. So the declaration stating that new marketing authorization holder has all the data in its possession to enable it to take over product responsibility. Sometimes it's a single line, but it means a significant amount. And all your planning, all your strategic planning goes into that one statement where you sign it off and you say, okay, I feel comfortable that we can manage this and we have all the information. You move then to the regulatory submission to the authorities. The physical submission of the actual transferred documents. In some regions, this can actually just be a variation. In others, it may just be a notification. But actually, how you submit and the premise under which you submit really needs to be understood and appreciated, as it can really impact the sort of implementation post-approval. Therefore, it's really imperative that we appreciate and understand the specific timelines and the authority requirements. So again, it links to this non-harmonized process, this data gathering and really understanding what we need to do in each of those markets. It's not one single approach works for every single market. There's elements on here as well in relation to your pharmacovigilance system updates. So, you've got updates to your QPPV details, your PSMF location. You need to ensure that you've got the appropriate reporting responsibilities in there. And along with that comes the more administrative side, which is your XE-EVMP updates as well. So the data that goes into the background, the migration of that. And I know, Nick, I won't steal your topic, but these are also really, really important activities and areas to consider. We talked also earlier, or Philip talked also earlier, about the manufacturing and supply chain impact. This is about continual supply of product, continually supplying regulatory compliant products. So we know that GMP responsibilities may change. We need to understand what those changes are. Is everybody aware of it? There will be updates to supply chain documentation, including your batch release procedures, really understanding any commitments to ensure that supply chain continuity and that those are mapped out accordingly. For example, if there's third parties involved, are they actually willing to continue to supply the new marketing authorization holder post-transfer? And we've seen examples as a company of where an API supplier or a finished product manufacturer actually refuses to supply their product to the new purchaser because of a potential conflict of interest. You need to be aware of this up front. You don't want to be significantly down the road on this journey and then discover that, because these are critical points to consider. Again, there's elements of timelines and cut-off dates. Until when and to what extent will the seller continue to provide the necessary support with regulatory information and data transfer? How long will they be willing to commercially supply the product for, and what do those dates look like? Labeling considerations as well, until when the old and new labeling product can continue on the market and to coexist in a single market. Phil talked about the burn rate of product and potential stockpiling and continuing with the old product until the new marketing authorization holder is in a position to bring their product to market. And fundamentally, at which point will the new marketing authorization holder be on their own and be totally responsible for the product? So there are transition and transfer agreements that need to be in place. And then finally, on this slide, it's really that communication and notification. That's communication both internally and externally. Communication with your internal stakeholders around the progress, the status, communications with the current MA holder who you're transferring from, but also those communications with your healthcare professionals, for example, and maybe even your customers. And you will also need to be communicating with the relevant authorities. You may also need to negotiate some timelines to be able to finally complete. So I think what this gives you in this sort of a single slide is actually how complex the whole operation can be, and that actually it touches upon many different areas, which I'll go into in a subsequent slide. But Nick, if we go to the next slide, on here, it's what I've tried to demonstrate, and again, it was nice because Phil touched upon it, is this sort of non-harmonized process. So really, we talked about that regulatory intelligence and that data gathering. On this slide, we just talk about the European Union specifically, where you've got different products, different registration pathways. So here we've got centralized products, we've got decentralized products, you've got mutually recognized products, and you've got nationally registered products. And each one of those procedures has a slightly different approach. So for your centralized procedure, you can just do a single application to the European Medicines Agency. For your decentralized and your mutually recognized products, as well as your nationally approved products, you may be dealing directly with the national competent authority. And these approaches can vary country to country. So again, understanding what needs to happen in those markets is really important. And Nick, if we just go to the next slide. Here we talk about the UK specifically. So now the UK sits outside the European Union. So again, it has its own independent route. You're engaging directly with the MHRA. You're submitting your change of ownership via the MHRA's portal. So do you have access to the portal? There's some preliminary steps that you may need to do, i.e. you may need to request the product license numbers directly from the MHRA in advance of your progressing your application. And the timelines are typically much quicker than on the previous slide at European level. So it could be 6 to 8 weeks. It could be fairly quick, actually. So again, the UK, different consideration in the post-Brexit space. If we go to the next slide, Nick. Here, we've got a slide indicating the difference in the US. So again, it's a very regional, very market-specific approach. Here, we've got the letter of authorization to be submitted and the MA transfer letter to the FDA. You know, we still need to update the marketing authorization holder's name and address in the various applications. You know, and we may be able to file changes in this instance through the annual report or prior approval supplement. So again, different considerations, and the timelines again are varying depending on the type of submission. If we go to the next slide, please, Nick. And here again, it's just building on that suggestion of this regional complexity. So here we just call out Health Canada, Australia, Brazil, and the GCC and Asia Pacific specifically. But what I really wanted you to take home from the last 4 slides is this sort of regional complexity, again building on this suggestion of a non-harmonized process, this indication of, you know, regulatory intelligence. It's not just for one market, you need to consider it for all the markets. You know, are you as a purchaser familiar with all the regulatory requirements of all the territories? It can be quite significant. You know, the regulatory requirements and commercial side of things vary from one market to another. Therefore, it's important to know what the level of understanding that you have as a potential marketing authorization holder. So, you know, we've had examples where a company from the US wanted to acquire a marketing authorization in Europe. You know, they had an affiliate office in Switzerland, for example, and they assumed that this entity could hold the marketing authorization. But this is not the case, because Switzerland is outside of the European Union. So they would need their marketing authorization holding at a European office. Certain markets also require an in-market presence. We have roles like the exploitant in France or local safety officers for PV, etc. These are mandated roles that have to be in the market, and you have to have them set up. There are also other things like specific labeling and promotional and marketing and reimbursement requirements that need to be considered. All of this creates quite a complex sort of framework and matrix of things that we need to build well in advance. If we go to the next slide. I'm just conscious of time as well, so I need to leave Nick some time to present as well. So I'll go through my next slides quite quickly, because I think Phil's touched upon some of these as well, which is quite nice. But at the end here, what I've tried to do is really present that sort of the key activities, I suppose, sort of best practices for a global marketing authorization transfer, sort of a tabulated view of what would be really, really important. So we've talked about the development of the global transfer plan, harmonizing your timelines, tracking local requirements, using project management tools as you really need them, ensuring that all your legal agreements are in place, finalizing those marketing authorization holder transfer agreements, and outlining the scope and responsibilities really, really critical. Continued compliance. I think Phil talked about it. I've talked about it. That avoidance of product supply disruption, ensuring continuous QP, PV, and GMP coverage. Ensuring that you've got the regulatory framework and compliance framework covered. That notification of all stakeholders, everybody kept in the loop. More, we really want to be hyper communicating in these processes, ensuring that we're all involved. Labeling management becomes critical. The updated labeling and the implementation of your new label into the market is again a super important point. That traceability and then submission management, again, underpinning it all. And then on my last slide, Nick, it goes back to the diagram that Phil had very early on. And I really like this slide, actually, because what we've demonstrated over the last, over the presentation in terms of what I've just delivered in terms of the operational excellence is how regulatory has a key role within the management, coordination, and understanding in the planning stages of the marketing authorization transfers. It's critical, really, and it links directly with that labeling and artwork piece that Phil talked about and the impact on labeling and artworks. But we do touch so many different functions, and each one of these functions links with regulatory, but they've got their own considerations in the background. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of them. I was going to, but in the interest of time, I won't. What I did want to say, and what is a really, really important point, is the piece around project management and governance. Because really, for these to be successful, you have to have robust project management and governance wrapped around all of it. Individuals that are tracking and tracing and understanding what the different steps are. So these have to be, these marketing authorization transfers have to be considered as large, complex projects. They pull resources away from the routine work and can be very, very labor intensive, but they are by definition cross-functional. And one of the key areas there in terms of the marketing authorization transfer is that the IT and systems and data transfer, which will support you as a new marketing authorization holder. So I think that gives me a nice segue to Nick, actually, and I'll finish mine there. So thanks. Nick, I hand over to you.
Thank you, James, for that. So I'll try to give you some insights into some of the challenges we see in data migration when we're doing M&A activities. First of all, these migrations are usually quite big. They have an effort that goes across different stakeholders and different areas in the companies, especially when they acquire other companies. So it means that there is a high data complexity. These data can go across regions, across areas. They might depend in age as well, right? So you might have 20-year-old data and documents, which doesn't have the same metadata. So actually, it's quite a complex setup when we have to integrate those data into the existing systems. There's often a lack of standardization in formats and metadata. Sometimes we see these data come in without any metadata. Sometimes it's unstructured and in Excel sheets with a lot of free text. And in the very good cases, those are coming from control systems where there's a structure to the data. There's also a lot of legacy issues. So those data might have been migrated multiple times before when changing systems. Means there's a lot of variation in the structure and also the data around the documents. There's of course all of the compliance risks in this, and just having an overview of what data do we actually move, which data is going to which systems. And are there any specific rules depending on countries that we need to take into consideration? And then just I would say general thing in M&As is the poor data quality. All companies think that they have good data quality. That is not the case in most cases. So duplicates, records, missing links, obsolete records, all of these things, especially if you're coming from like a network share where all those documents are just in one big pile. There's also the change management side of this and the inconsistent governance around this. I think James talked about that as well. So just getting an overview of the data, getting access. You might think that access is an easy topic, but sometimes we see this actually can take up to 3 months before we have access to the relevant data. We also usually have tight timelines in these M&A migrations, and they are usually last on the priority list in terms of getting those in. The M&A migrations we have done in the past are usually between 1,000 to 5,000 hours, depending on the size. So it has a huge impact on the process, and it's very time consuming in getting these data in, whether they are unstructured or structured data. This next slide is might look a bit chaotic, but that's sorry, that's just skipped here. And then that's also intended, right? So we need to sort, we need to filter, we need to divert the documents and data so it goes into the right systems. We need to split it. You might also have ongoing activities in other areas. So we need to align in terms of service windows and making sure that we get the data into the right system. And as we also saw on some of the previous slides, with the different stakeholders, it's the same from a migration perspective. We might have stakeholders in the clinical area, the quality and the regulatory in terms of moving data in. So it's quite a complex situation to be in when migrating data. It's often not a one-to-one move. Data might be going into different targets. And you might also have data that doesn't fit in anywhere. Maybe some data is going to the archive. Maybe you have a bunch of data that you know where it belongs, and the person who worked with those data has left the company. So a quite complex process where you need good governance, good project management, good oversight, and people who have done it before. Otherwise, it's you could risk of missing data to get into the system. Yeah, so this is what a normal process looks like from a migration perspective. If I would give any recommendation in this area, it is to include the migration team when the contracts are signed, because usually we're in at a later point, which makes the timelines more tight and a higher risk of leaving items out. So yeah, include your migration team from the beginning. Then we need access to data. We need to try to get an oversight or insights into the data. What data do we have? Which areas of the data going into? And how can we actually move these? And if there's differences in terms of the structure of data that's going into the same system, we need to do a thorough mapping on that. Then doing the actual filtering and sorting, so which files are going into which systems. You might need to classify your documents according to your targets. You need to identify the metadata gaps and do extraction of those. You need to do the mapping as well. Once the mapping is done, it's the cleaning, transformation, and enhancements phase. And then we can do migration into the sandbox environments, validation, and production. This is normally a huge manual effort. You can automate things, but you can also look into AI as an assistant in terms of doing that, right? So if you acquire a company, you might receive 5 million documents that you need to classify and filter and sort. And that's very difficult doing with manual labor. So what we're doing and where you can actually look into applying AI in that process is from the beginning review of contracts, risks and gaps, then doing the insights. There's a lot of help to be received in that area with these large language models that we have now in the AI area. So indexing of the data, filtering the different domains, doing a data quality assessment in terms of the targets that we're moving data into. Help in the selection of data to migrate, maybe also prioritize. All data might not be equally important to get in. And then the classification, where we can actually classify documents based on the target classification model, at least as a draft. In the metadata area, we can identify the gaps and extract metadata automatically based on logic. And once we have done the classification and we updated the metadata, we can draft the mapping for the different targets with AI as well. Then we still have to do the cleaning, transformation and enhancement and do the actual migration. But most of the effort and hours goes into the classification and metadata extraction and mapping. So applying AI in this context is actually where we see a lot of benefits. I know there's a lot of hype around AI at the moment, and use cases can be difficult to sort of show value on. But at least in these very manual labor, time-consuming tasks, there is a good chance that AI can help you in that process. Good. Over to you, Phil.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much, Nick. I think just shining a light there on some of the complexities, right? Thinking about moving dossiers and registration information and different phases of information, is a complex process in and of itself. We, I think, hopefully, have illustrated to you that what could be viewed as quite an administrative process, does need a lot of upfront planning to be successful. I mean, obviously it depends, right? It depends what you're purchasing. what you're selling, the countries that are involved. If it's a single country, for one product, it's going to be relatively straightforward. But oftentimes, we're certainly engaged helping companies that are having to cover, multiple regions, jurisdictions, multiple products, and that adds to the complexity significantly. So again, please don't underestimate the planning that's required to make these big programs of work successful. So we have had some questions in the chat facility, so that's great. Thank you for that. And again, I urge you to kind of send in questions again if you think of things after the webinar. There are questions around, essentially regulatory intelligence, right? We can group them into that as one category. What are the submission requirements? What are the documents that you need to provide? The list of documents to support a transfer application, and it varies, right? It varies greatly from country to country. And James, I don't know if you want to kind of touch on that.
Oh yeah, I think in its simplest form, it does vary. You've got your all the documents we're talking about. So in terms of the regulatory application, it's fairly straightforward. It's a fairly discrete, certainly at a European level anyway, it's a fairly discrete dossier application that's presented. And within there, you may just have specific declarations, you may have your updated artworks, etc., and the dates, etc., that you're moving towards. But yeah, as Phil says, and as we've said throughout this, it really is very country specific, and that local regulatory intelligence and intelligence gathering really does set the tone for how you present those marketing authorization transfer applications. So again, in the UK, it's got its own process, where you have to request your product license numbers, then you have to update your labeling components, you've got your application form that you present. But really, I think the take-home message from today is not necessarily about the regulatory components that go into the submission, because that information can be found through your regulatory intelligence searches, or utilizing a company like ourselves to support you in that process. It's really those broader conversations that happen in the background that I think are really, really critical to ensure. So are you meeting your obligations as a marketing authorization holder? Are you set up to be a marketing authorization holder in those regions? And yes, you may have an office already in the market you're going to, great, but you could be a completely new marketing authorization holder. And that's where those considerations such as regulatory, quality, safety, pharmacovigilance, all of those start to come into play. So again, linking back to what I said earlier on, the actual application side, in my view, is probably the more simple part of the whole process, but there's a huge wealth of activity that's happening in the background that needs to be considered in terms of the planning, the staging, and the flighting of those submissions. But then also from a regulatory perspective, ensuring all those legislative parts are met by you as a marketing authorization holder of those products that you're buying. So for me, that's probably the more compelling aspect, Phil, and to the person that asked the question, not necessarily all the bits that go into the application, but it's a good question, but thank you.
Yeah, and I think we link to that, and another question, from a regulatory perspective around stock, right? So you have stock which will be in the packaging of the current marketing authorization holder that's could be out in the market. After the approval, that stock will be allowed to be in market for a given period of time, and that period of time is dependent on the country, right? And then as is introduction of stock in the delivery of the new marketing authorization holder. Again, it varies pretty significantly from market to market. It's usually a matter of months rather than years, but again, it goes back to having the right regulatory intelligence in place to feed into your regulatory planning piece, and then into the management of stock to supply into those markets. So yeah, we are happy to help with those sort of inquiries. If you have specific market in place, we can provide that detail. I think there was one other question that we got about using kind of a third-party consultant as a bridge between the selling company and the acquiring company. Read the question out. Is it possible to hire a consultant to manage specifically the transition period, providing a service to both the buyer and the seller that's not needed to negotiate or agree on who should be responsible for performing each activity. You certainly can hire a consultant, but the consultant can't decide on the agreements in place between those two parties, right? I mean, but they can bring expertise and experience to support in those discussions. Of course, they will be contracted by one or the other parties, or unless there's some sort of joint agreement to contract with that person. But certainly, yeah, you can have a consultant that can support you in setting up those agreements in the first place. Okay, and then we've got another question. In Europe, what is the usual timeline for supplying the stock? So I'm assuming this is, you know, the stock in the packaging of the new MAH. Again, there is some variety in the timelines. It does even in Europe, right? You know, in the EU, let's call it the EU, not Europe. Let's be technically correct. The requirements for marketing authorization transfers at the national level differ from country to country. It's not harmonized, as are the requirements for having stock in the new livery of the new MAH in the market. So it depends how the product is registered. If it's a CP product, obviously that's different to if it's a nationally approved product as well. So again, we are happy to take questions. We can provide that information specifically for certain markets, but we can't give a blanket answer which will cover every single country because it's different from every single country. So, okay, so we're at the hour. So thank you everybody for joining today. We will share the slides and the recording. As I said, please do contact us with additional questions. We've put on the screen there an email address for any initial questions you may have. And I, again, draw your attention to the fact this is the first in a series of 2 webinars. And so look out for more publicity around the next webinar, and I hope you can join that one as well. So we'll sign off now. So thank you all again for your time today.
Thank you.